the fact that we have millions of young people taking to the streets demanding a future, that we're not destroying this planet, means that they're being energized by these energies, these positive energies for change. Well, I think that over the next hundreds of years that humanity will be transformed, the structures of humanity, the cities, the lifestyles, the educational process, the science, the religion of humanity will be transformed into something totally new and something that maybe only exists in the dreams of people nowadays. But we'll have cities that are totally of beauty, and we'll have lifestyles that people will have much more time, much more leisure time to study and develop their consciousness. We'll have no more poverty on the planet. There will be sharing and justice for all. And I think that that will be something that we'll be all able to look forward to as a beautiful new civilization for humanity.
And that is a foretaste of this episode of the Planetary Makeover Show. In response to the heartfelt voices of an awakening humanity, we have evidence that divine help is at hand to work with us to create a hopeful future.
Welcome, I'm your host David Mynott, artist, activist, environmentalist, here to welcome our guest, Rich Teich, who is a scholar of the spiritual esoteric wisdom, which, as you probably already know, encompasses all of the world's religions and their central truths. And as you know, our focus on Planetary Makeover is the emergence of the world teacher Maitreya, but we can't talk about that without discussing what Rich is going to illuminate us on today, the externalization of the hierarchy. The contents of this book by Alice A. Bailey was given to her by the great Himalayan master Djwhal Khol. It is part of the wisdom teaching which, throughout the ages, affirmed the fact of an intelligent spiritual direction, a chain of being underlying the evolutionary process of consciousness. The esoteric term hierarchy refers to that group of spiritual beings on the inner planes who are the intelligent forces of nature and who control the evolutionary process. Rich, happy to have you here.
Thank you, David. I'm glad to be here.
And I understand you have a quote that you'd like to read to us before we begin our exploration of the topic.
Yes, I thought that to give an overview of what we're going to be covering in brief, we'll be looking at what is the nature of humanity on this planet, what is the nature of the spiritual kingdom that we call the hierarchy, what are the kingdoms in nature, and what is the nature of the internal structure of the hierarchy. How do we see it from our point of view? What do they see? And also, kind of in conclusion, what will it look like when the hierarchy is externalized in the sense that they are a part of our everyday lives? And then from that, the highest aspect of the hierarchy, which is the great lords, the main one that embodies love and wisdom, we call the Bodhisattva or the Christ. And how will that work out into our everyday lives? So that's kind of a broad field, but we'll try to cover it in some fashion.
Fascinating. And now, onto that great quote that you had prepared for us.
Yes, in order to set a context, I thought that I would read a description by Paramahansa Yogananda, who was one of the first great teachers from India who came to America in 1920. And he was given an experience of cosmic consciousness for the first time when he was a student of his teacher Sri Yukteswar in India. And this will kind of set a context for the larger picture of who is humanity and what is going on this planet, who are we. So I think then from that we will work into some details. But I will start this off. It's almost like a poem in a way. It's so poetic in the way it's expressed. So Sri Yukteswar was his spiritual teacher, his guru, and gave him his first experience of cosmic consciousness. After that, he was able to do this on his own, but this is his first experience and his first description of that. Sri Yukteswar struck gently on my chest, above the heart. My body became immovably rooted. Breath was drawn out of my lungs as if by some huge magnet. Soul and mind instantly lost their physical bondage and streamed out like a fluid-piercing light from my every pore. An oceanic joy broke upon calm, endless shores of my soul. The Spirit of God, I realized, is exhaustless bliss. His body is countless tissues of light. A swelling glory within me began to envelop towns, continents, the earth, solar and stellar systems, tenuous nebula, and floating universes. The entire cosmos, gently luminous, like a city seen afar at night, glimmered within the infinitude of my being. The sharply etched global outlines faded somewhat at the farthest edges. There I could see a mellow radiance, ever undiminished. It was indescribably subtle. The planetary pictures were formed of a grosser light. The divine dispersion of rays poured from an eternal source, blazing into galaxies, transfigured into ineffable auras. Again and again I saw the creative beams condense into constellations, then resolve into sheets of transparent flame. By rhythmic reversion, 6 trillion worlds passed into diaphanous luster. Fire became firmament. I cognized the center of the Imperium as a point of intuitive perception in my heart. Irradiating splendor issued from my nucleus to every part of the universal structure. Blissful Amrita, the nectar of immortality, pulsed through me like a quicksilver-like fluidity. The creative voice of God I heard resounding as Om, the vibration of the cosmic motor. Suddenly, the breath returned to my lungs. With a disappointment almost unbearable, I realized that my infinite immensity was lost. Once again, I was limited to the humiliating cage of a body, not easily accommodative to the spirit. Like a prodigal child, I had run away from my macrocosmic home and imprisoned myself in a narrow microcosm.
That is absolutely astounding, Rich, and makes me envious. I wish I could experience that.
Well, the point is that this is the center of every human being. They just haven't been able to realize it. But through the evolutionary process, eventually that they will, and that's the goal for humanity, to have that experience of themselves. But not just the experience, but also being in the physical body while they have that. So, for example, if you die, you'll be able to go to some higher worlds and have cosmic experiences in a sense, but you won't be here on the planet. And so that's where you get to the kingdoms in nature and the evolutionary process. So the various kingdoms, there are 5 kingdoms in nature. If you include the spiritual kingdom above humanity, so there's the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, the human kingdom, and the spiritual kingdom, which is the beings who have become liberated and are staying behind to help humanity evolve. So each kingdom is an intelligence, each kingdom has a goal and a development of its own, and each kingdom evolves from the kingdom below it. So in the mineral kingdom, the quality it's trying to develop in itself is what we would call discrimination, because the minerals have to evolve into certain structures, and they do this through discriminating various types of atoms and molecules in their structures. So in what we would see in the development of the mineral kingdom, in its highest levels, we would see the metals, for example, the base metals like lead and iron. We would see at the next level, it evolves into the metals that we call gold and silver are standard metals, and then beyond that it develops into crystals and gemstones, which is the highest development of the mineral kingdom. So in its evolution, it produces these higher and higher quality forms. In the vegetable kingdom, we have the experience of sensation being developed, and we see it involving as the grasses and the trees, and next in the flowering kingdom. So we see the beautiful flowers and their aromas are the highest expression of the vegetable kingdom. And then in the animal kingdom, it's developing in a rudimentary intelligence we would call instinct, and we see that especially in the domestic animals like the elephants and the cats and the dogs, and anything that has contact with humanity, and humanity is interacting with it to produce more intelligence in the animal kingdoms. Then there's the human kingdom, which is a summation of the qualities of the others, but is also trying to develop full intelligence, and not just a rudimentary instinctive intelligence, and that the goal for the human kingdom is to evolve into the spiritual kingdom, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of souls. It already has the germ within it of those kingdoms, and the quality that the next kingdom, the spiritual kingdom, is developing fully is the experience of the oneness of love wisdom for all beings. So that's the goal for that kingdom, and humanity is beginning to feel the beginnings of that in themselves. And then the highest development in the spiritual kingdom is trying to embody the full will or purpose of the being who ensouls this whole planet. So that the highest level on the planet is a center, esoterically called Shambhala, the center where the will of God is known, and that is basically creating this entire planet and all the evolutions on the planet, so that the energy of life is pouring through this entire planet, keeping it alive from moment to moment. And that's references back to what Yogananda was describing as the motor, the cosmic motor. And so the being who ensouls this planet sounds the Om on its own high plane, and that produces this planet and everything on it. So if for some reason, which wouldn't happen, the logos of this planet, the being who ensouls the planet, stops sounding the Om, the whole planet would essentially just disappear because it wouldn't exist anymore. So this is kind of the spectrum of existence on our planet. So the being who ensouls the planet is expressing itself through all the kingdoms in nature, and especially the spiritual kingdom, which is aspiring to have the consciousness of the being who ensouls the planet, which we call Shambhala, and that humanity is then the bridge between the higher spiritual kingdoms and the lower three kingdoms. So that's kind of a larger architecture of how this looks.
If in recapping that very thorough explanation, if you could just touch briefly upon once again, and just briefly, before we go on to our next question and your next fascinating explanation, as humanity, and particularly for people who are new to this information, if you could tell us just briefly again who we are, where we came from, and where we're going.
The origin of humanity is from a very high plane of consciousness, or consciousness and being, and 18.5 million years ago, the vehicles at that time, the most developed part of the animal kingdom, which we would call early animal man, had these sparks of the divine implanted in early animal man, and that began this evolutionary process for humanity. So there's a lot of references in what Yogananda was saying about cosmic consciousness to fire. So the universe is actually fire, and that spark of individuality that each person has is a spark of the fire who is the whole being who ensouls this planet. And so the goal of the evolutionary process is to return to that experience of cosmic consciousness, that experience of cosmic oneness with the whole being who ensouls this planet. So that's the destiny and the goal. And in that process, and the reason why it's happening, is that humanity, by immersing itself individually as these sparks of the divine into the lower kingdoms, helps them to evolve. And so one of the goals of the hierarchy, this planetary hierarchy of masters, is to evolve consciousness in all the kingdoms in nature. So you've had this vast evolutionary process that's constantly going on from the lowest kingdoms, from the mineral kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, and the animal kingdom, and through the human kingdom, is to evolve to whatever the highest level of development that they are capable of in this particular planetary cycle.
I think what strikes me most about that, Rich, is the unity that you're describing and expressing, which brings me to the title of one of Benjamin Cram's books, Unity in Diversity. And that ought to give our audience something to ponder upon, as the Master DK often said, the Master Joelle Cole, who is said to overshadow Alice Bailey and her series of books. And it's certainly giving me something to ponder upon. So now that you've described humanity's origins and why we're here and where we're going and the kingdoms in nature, could you delve more into, which I know you've already touched upon, our central topic, what is the hierarchy?
Yes. So in this, there's a series of graded points in this evolutionary process. And those points are basically where the soul is able to manifest itself in the various, what we call vehicles. The mental, emotional, and physical are actually vehicles that humanity manifests through. So when you're in a physical body, you also have a subtle body, you have an emotional body, and you have a mental body, and those bodies are being evolved through the process of your incarnation, as these spiritual energies from the soul come through and stimulate these various bodies, which are made up of small, tiny lives, and that produces the evolution of the body. The masters themselves, the masters of wisdom, the spiritual hierarchy, look like human beings. They have bodies. The bodies are not have reached basically their highest point of development, but what's now being evolved is higher states of awareness and consciousness. So the masters have cosmic consciousness, and humanity's goal is to develop into that. There are 63 masters in the spiritual hierarchy. The three highest embody the qualities of will or purpose, love, wisdom, and intelligence. And the being who is in charge of basically of the evolutionary process of consciousness we call the Christ or the Bodhisattva. It's like an office, and the being who has that job or that role in the hierarchy has it for a certain period of time and then moves on to higher work. So right now it's the Lord Maitreya who occupies the office of the Christ, and in this process of that's probably the most significant event that's happening in history of this planet. After the implantation of those individual sparks in early animal man 18.5 million years ago, what's happening now is that humanity will realize its higher aspect of itself, and these great beings who are the spiritual hierarchy, many of them will, and their disciples will be part of our everyday world and will be known by everyone on the planet who they are. And that's going to be this revolutionary time we're in. That will be happening over the next hundreds of years. Yes.
Fascinating. It's hard to take all this in, and yet I can't resist. And the more you talk about this, the more I, and I'm sure the audience, want to hear. We'll just have to find a way to digest it all. Now, you've touched upon the connection between the spiritual hierarchy and humanity. So let's delve into the topic of the new group of world servers. When they started, why they started, who began it, who are members, and where that's taking us.
Yes. So in the process of externalization of the hierarchy, or we have basically a speeding up process in this evolutionary process. There are cosmic energies which are coming into the planet now of greater magnitude than they have ever been in the past. And so in this great system of cycles of energy coming in and going out of the planet, they're being made use of by the spiritual hierarchy to speed up this evolution of humanity. And when they do that, that means that there are now thousands and thousands of people that are ready to enter the hierarchy. So this puts a challenge to them to use different approaches than they had in the past, when there were just a few people who were going through this process to enter the hierarchy. So these what are called initiations, there are graded expansions of consciousness, starting off with the physical plane. And you can see that manifesting today because there are millions of people around the world who are now working with their physical bodies through exercise, through bicycling, through jogging, marathons, paying attention to their health. This is all preliminary to taking of the first initiation. So you can see that this is going on in all countries around the world. People are becoming more conscious of their bodies and trying to facilitate their development. Then after a number of lifetimes, say 6 or 7 lifetimes, going through this process, their consciousness will be expanded at the second initiation into a control of their emotional vehicle. And then shortly thereafter, the mental, emotional, and physical bodies will be synthesized essentially by the soul and emerged into a soul-infused personality. And that they call the third initiation. At the next initiation, the soul will be no longer needed as an intermediary principle. The aspect of humanity, the highest aspect, the spark of God, which they call the monad, will then be able to be in direct contact with the physical vehicle down below that's been prepared through this evolutionary process. And the being who was acting as the soul, the intermediary, plus the experience that has had, will return to its high source on the cosmic mental plane, and human beings then will be monad infused, spiritual infused, cosmic consciousness infused individual beings. And when that happens, they will be in direct touch with the purpose of this planet through that being who ensouls the planet that they were calling the planetary logos. So these initiations, the first 2 initiations, are performed for humanity individually by the Christ. That's his job as the being who ensouls the love and wisdom aspect, the evolutionary force in consciousness. So that's his role, is to bring humanity into the hierarchy through the first and second initiations. Then the third and higher initiations are performed by the being who ensouls this planet as an individuality that's called, in the Ageless Wisdom teaching, Sanat Kumara, who is a being who went through the human stage in many early solar systems, is now here as the representative on the physical etheric level of the being who ensouls this whole planet. So there is an individual who that we see as the being who ensouls the planet. We can see them as an individual being, a person with a physical body, but he exists on the subtle planes in a center which is called Shambhala. So this is the kind of the evolutionary process. When a person has achieved masterhood, when they've achieved that continuous state of cosmic consciousness, they can evolve off the planet to higher planes. There are higher planets in the solar system than the Earth, and at that point they leave the planet. So there are these 7 paths that you can take once you've graduated from the planet, from basically a school, in a sense, school for developing consciousness. And that goal of leaving the planet is achieved by most of humanity in the future, but a few remain behind as the teachers of the race. So those teachers of qualities of livingness, mental, emotional, and physical, will, love, intelligence, those few people will remain behind to help humanity evolve, while the majority of humanity will leave the planet to higher realms, basically. So that's that kind of evolutionary process that goes on from a larger standpoint.
I see. My goodness. It sounds like a long process, something that, as I think you mentioned, takes many lifetimes. And I was wondering, too, if you could, now that you've mentioned some of the members of the hierarchy, some of the new group of world servers that we're familiar with, both in different fields and different parts of the planet.
All right, so the new group of world servers was established in 1925 to act as a bridge between hierarchy and humanity. Because this speeding up process means that there'll be thousands and eventually millions of people that will go through the evolutionary process and become part of the hierarchy and then move on from there. That bridge of people who are the most spiritually evolved of humanity and just on the verge of entering the hierarchy, there's two parts to that group. One is people we would call humanitarians, the people who have a great love for helping humanity in some way. And others, the second group, is actually junior members in a way of the hierarchy of first and second degree initiates, who are more in contact with the purpose and the plan of hierarchy. So I guess it has to be emphasized that there is a plan working out for all this evolutionary process, not just the lower kingdoms in nature, but also humanity. So the plan is administered and created by the hierarchy for humanity. These forms we would call cultures, and their resulting civilizations. If you look down through history, you can see that humanity's history has consisted, historically as we understand it, of many civilizations, both in the East and the West, over thousands of years. They have come and gone, and during any given civilization, humanity of that civilization will develop certain qualities, and the civilization will then come to an end, and the new life will form go to a different time and space and form a new civilization, which again allows humanity to evolve some more, and that just goes on for thousands of years. So now what's happening is that humanity is beginning to see itself as one humanity, as one family, and that's never happened before. And that's a result of this evolutionary process and these energies that are speeding up the evolution on this planet and allowing hierarchy then to work more closely with humanity. And so that's what the new group of world servers do. They bring the ideas from hierarchy into humanity through whatever field that they're working in. And so three examples from the past of these people who are doing this. The first one I thought of was Rachel Carson, her work in ecology, and her book Silent Spring, which alerted people to the effect that we're having on our environment and in nature. The second person I thought of would be Jonas Salk, who worked in science and medicine and who brought through the polio vaccine, which alleviated the suffering of millions of people, potentially. And when asked whether he was going to patent his discovery, he said, "No, how can you patent the sun? It belongs to all of humanity." The third person I thought of was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of the main persons driving the force of the United Nations, and she was behind the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you can see in different fields, she was basically in politics and in media, working with the public, in science, in ecology, all humanitarians, all bringing through from hierarchy certain ideas that will have an effect on the mass of humanity through the work that they were doing. So those are good examples, I think, of new group of world servers. But there's thousands and thousands of people who are working in this capacity around the world and developing into now millions of people around the world who are trying to help humanity. But there are also forces which are trying to offset the work of the hierarchy to produce higher consciousness, and these we call the forces of materiality. You can see that working out today, wherever totalitarian forces, whether at country level or at the individual level, at the state level, and in politics, they're trying to keep this process of evolution from moving forward. So they're putting up roadblocks wherever they can. And so that's why we see there's a kind of a war going on between the forces of light, the forces of hierarchy, the forces of God, working to overcome the materiality that humanity is immersed in. So when spirit descends into matter, when the individual souls are immersed in the lower aspects of matter, they have to extricate themselves through this evolutionary process, and there are forces which are holding up the matter aspect and trying to keep that from happening, essentially retarding that process as much as possible. And you can see that working out today. The great ideologies, pro and con, for humanity or against humanity.
It's encouraging to know that all these forces are at play every hour of the day, going on for thousands of years, and that despite all the chaos that we're suffering through now, there is a parallel course, a parallel development, a parallel movement towards progress, and that the spiritual energy is breaking up the inertia of materiality and forcing us, even when we don't want to move forward. And so in line with that, how is this energy manifesting today? Where do we see that taking effect in important current events today, like the environment, for example?
Well, I don't know if you follow the media on a daily basis, but you should. And you can see in every aspect of human life there is conflict going on, especially in certain countries like the United States, which is the most materialistic country in the world, but then also has the most spiritual potential. And so you're seeing that working out through politics and through business and through the demand for justice, environmental justice, racial justice, economic justice. Those are the qualities of the hierarchy. The recognition of oneness and unity for all of humanity, whereas the forces of materiality are trying to separate people. And so you're seeing that force of separation going on, the rich and the poor, the black and the white, the people who are essentially wanting to move forward and the people who are not wanting to move forward. One of the effects of these energies that are coming in so powerfully nowadays is to produce a polarization of ideologies, you could say. There are people who are not able to move forward because they're still too immersed in the matter aspect. So that's creating a lot of fear. That's the result of these energies pouring in. Meanwhile, the people who are receptive to these energies are finding the demand for justice now coming into their own lives. They're taking to the streets by the millions. So you see these two polarities. Groups who don't want to change, they're frightened by the change that's going on in so many different areas in life. And the people who feel that it's almost like a spiritual demand in themselves that they have to step up and start taking action in some way. So ultimately the political field is the one that has to change, because that's where the power lies. The structures are controlled by politics. The structure of government controls business, for example.
Wow. That's almost too much to take in at this point. But at the same time, it's so encouraging and uplifting that I think everyone that hears it would want to embrace it. So with these two competing energies, Rich, based on what's happening now, who would you say, light or darkness, has the upper hand at this point, and how long has that been so?
I think that it's been relatively equal as a result of the World War, which was basically looks like two wars, but in fact that's one war. The energies of humanity's past have been crystallized into a war so that it has to make a choice about what direction it was going to go. And so we had the forces of the Axis powers that represented materiality, and the forces of the United Nations, which had the backing of hierarchy to overcome that. And so that conflict, which according to the ageless wisdom has been going on for millions of years on the higher planes, was now focused by the karma of humanity down to the physical plane. And the most important result of that was that the hierarchy could then come back and the Christ was allowed to return onto the physical plane. Prior to the end of the war, it was not determined whether he would be able to come in a physical body or only on some higher plane of the mental or the astral plane, the emotional plane. So that was a big result of the war, was that it now meant that the Christ, Maitreya, could come forward in a physical body during this next period which we're involved in now. And we're seeing that working out. It's really a matter of interpreting events when you can see that there is some kind of a plan working out behind all of these events which are leading to conflict. Essentially, the way the hierarchy works to produce produce consciousness in people is by creating crises. So these crises are actually being precipitated out. And a crisis creates, in an individual and a group, it creates a kind of an experience of having to make a decision. Crisis produces a conflict, an inner conflict in the person, and each individual then has to decide for themselves what they're going to do. And some people just refuse to move forward, to think about it, to talk about it. And the other people then find that they want to look for people who are like-minded, and that's why you see groups forming on both sides. The fact that we have millions of young people taking to the streets demanding a future. We're not destroying this planet. They're being energized by these energies, these positive energies, for change. So that's how you're really seeing groups. The three, we can talk about the 7 ashrams, the 7 divisions of the hierarchy. 3 are coming out now, and you see them represented by politics, which is the first ray of energy. You're seeing the 5th ray of science. The scientists are working, the scientists who are working for the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which for the last 25 years have been coming out with reports telling us how we're destroying the planet. They are an expression of the hierarchy, the new group of world servers. The progressive people like Bernie Sanders and AOC in Congress, they're representing the spiritual aspect, the desire for humanity for a better life, for justice. And then the educational, the 2nd ray ashram, are people who are getting this information out. Like Planetary Makeover, they're putting this information out to the public, and so that's their job, working on this. So those 3 groups are working now to help bring this forward and into the consciousness of people all over the world.
All that information is truly liberating, Rich, especially when we think about things that you mentioned, such as the world wars, when so much of humanity looks upon that as merely destructive and a terrible tragedy, which of course it was, but don't realize that there is a silver lining to all this conflict, and that perhaps in the future we won't have to relate to that because humanity won't set up the kind of circumstances that necessitate a war and that type of release of energy. And speaking of energy, you had mentioned of the rays, and could you go into that a little bit more and describe what these 7 rays are?
Yes, we had mentioned that there are energies pouring into the planet. And these energies come from outside the solar system. They come in through the sun, and they're then sent out through the planets. Every planet is evolving, just as the Earth is evolving. There's a humanity on every planet, and the being who ensouls the solar system has a purpose that's working out through the solar system. And in order to have that purpose working out, energies are made use of by the various hierarchies in the solar system, on the planets, and those energies come in cyclically. And there's these 7 energies, which are called in esotericism the 7 rays, have different what we see as different qualities. They obviously have their own nature on higher planes or higher spheres, but we see them as 7 qualities that we could have psychological correspondences to, that would allow us to get a better grip on what they are. So the first ray is called will or purpose. The second ray is love, wisdom. The third ray is active intelligence. Now, these 3 rays are the 3 rays, what they call the 3 rays of aspect, and the 4 lower rays are the 4 rays of attribute. So the 4 lower rays actually fall under the 3rd ray of active intelligence. So if the 4th ray is called harmony through conflict, the 5th ray is science or concrete knowledge, the 6th ray is spiritual, I would say spiritual idealism or devotion to a cause, and the 7th ray is a pattern forming, what we call ceremonial order or magic. And each one of those rays of attribute are controlled in the hierarchy by the 3rd great lord that's called the Lord of Civilization. So the 1st ray energies are controlled by the being who is called the Manu, will or purpose. The 2nd is the energies, as we mentioned, of the office called the Bodhisattva or the Christ. And the 3rd is called in esoteric tradition, the Maha Chohan, or the Lord of Civilization. So in this process where humanity grows through a civilization that's created by the highest aspects of humanity at a particular point in time, they generate the energies we call culture. They get their energies from the hierarchy, and then as it filters down through the general public, it becomes what we call the culture of a particular time. And it's through those cultures that humanity has some structure to grow and develop certain qualities, the spiritual qualities. So as these rays cycle into incarnation or out of incarnation, they come in for hundreds or thousands of years, the hierarchy then will use those energies, those rays, in that timetable to produce certain results in humanity. So they are not in charge of when those energies come in or go out. Those energies are controlled from much higher levels through the planets, for example, in the system. Each one of the planets in a way manifests that energy from the sun and from outside the solar system, and so we see it on our plane in terms of time. We see them coming out in time. One thing that experience of cosmic consciousness was illustrating was not just the universe is fire, but the universe is also outside of time and space. He was seeing the entire universe forming and reforming constantly over billions and billions of years, but he was seeing it almost in real time. So that's being outside of time. So these energies are flowing in, but when we see them on the physical plane, we see them coming through in time in terms of a 100-year cycle or a 500-year cycle. And that's what the masters are using to produce these cultures and civilizations, and therefore evolution of humanity through those forms. So the reason it's called the Lord of Civilization is that that's the trellis in a way that humanity is growing on, and that those civilizations seem to come and dissolve, and they grow and they're dissolved back in, and other civilizations then come back, and so on. So there has to be a structure. That's why the energy of intelligence is needed to produce this growth process for humanity, because it's trying to develop the mind principle, the principle of active intelligence. So that's important in terms of development, but at the same time, the will or purpose of the planetary logos, the being who ensouls the planet, is coming in through the 1st ray energy, and that's the energy of purpose. The energy of life itself comes through that. So in order to bring certain civilizations to an end, certain cycles, certain ideologies, certain ways of thinking and feeling, the energy of this destructive aspect of the 1st ray is brought in to essentially dissolve that civilization and make a way for the new energies coming in through the growth aspect, which is the 2nd aspect. So love and wisdom produces the energy which allows forms to then new forms, new life to be created. So there's a relationship between these three, between life and death, between birth and rebirth, and then the structures which are formed in each one of those impulses we call the ray of active intelligence, the science, the business, the education, the religion. All those forms then are a manifestation of the culture and civilization of a particular time and place for humanity. So we're seeing constantly a flow of creation and destruction, creation to destruction, because from the master's point of view, they see that life is not there's no destruction of life. Life keeps growing. It's only the forms which are dissolved essentially, and then new life is allowed to reform back into new forms. So from their point of view, they see humanity as the sparks of the divine who leave incarnation, then come back into incarnation again in different forms, and that process is continuing on and on in the context of the plan which they are developing for all of humanity through thousands and thousands of years. So from their point of view, humanity, no one ever dies, they just leave incarnation. Decade, the master who was putting out the information through Alice Bailey, was saying that was the greatest accomplishment of the forces of evil, the forces of darkness, is to instill the fear of death in humanity. So humanity on this planet, everyone has some kind of a great fear of dying, when in fact it's a liberation from this form that we're in. It's a part of living and part of dying. So if you look at nature, you see that there's always seasons. Nature dies off and then comes back in the spring, dies off in the winter, and so that is a very natural process for all life on the planet. It just goes through cycles. And so one of the goals of the hierarchy is to have humanity see this as a natural process, so that they're not fearful of death anymore, of dissolving of old forms. So the conservative aspect of humanity's civilization right now, which is dying, is trying to hold on to the old forms. And the energies that are coming in are speeding up this evolutionary process, and there's a large part of humanity which is so bound to the old materialistic view, the experience of the past, that they can't let it go, and it's causing them great distress. Whereas the energies coming in, and the young people especially, who are coming in on a flood of new growth and new development in the future, are reveling in that energy, but they're also up against the old structures. So we have this conflict now with people holding on to the old structures. You can see that in terms of the fossil fuel industry, the greed of the wealthy people, the corporations who are trying to hold on to the old structures, governments which are trying to hold on to old forms, and the young people coming in, but they don't have the power yet, and they're looking for how to find themselves. And so one of the greatest things that's happening now through technology is that we're realizing we're one people through the technologies of the internet, for example, through telephone, the cell phones. You can call anybody on the planet, basically, if you have their cell phone number. So we're one, not just in a theoretical sense, but in a physical sense. We're also having effects on the environment. We're now seeing that the plastic that we use in everyday life is ending up on the top of the highest mountains and the bottom of the lowest oceans, and in our bodies. We're seeing, and so that's another way that we're basically seeing that we're having an effect on the planet, individually and collectively. The same with the weather, the superheat that's going on in India and Pakistan, the cold that's sweeping across places that were never that super frigid before, as the jet stream blows down the polar vortex. We're seeing extremes of all kinds, the hurricanes, the tornadoes in places that have never been seen before. So the process is affecting all of nature, not just the human kingdom, but all the kingdoms in nature are being affected by this acceleration process of the new energies coming in. So these are the effects of the rays. The rays are being intelligently controlled or manipulated as they are available by the hierarchy, and so they plan ahead thousands of years because they know when the rays are coming in and going out. So their work extends thousands of years into the future as to the formulation of a plan, but they're also getting feedback from the developmental level of humanity itself and what it can take. So right now we're seeing the greatest change on the planet since the early animal man was impregnated by those sparks of the divine 18.5 million years ago that began the evolutionary process. We are now at the point where people will realize that they're back one again. When you get split into so many different separate bodies, you're separated from everybody else, and now we're recognizing our oneness through many different ways. At the same time, there's a large aspect of humanity which is fearful, cannot move forward, and is reacting against those new energies which are coming in.
Very good. Very good. That was an extremely comprehensive and encouraging revelation, which points to the need for both education and, given the time spans you're talking about, patience. Well, Rich, this was a tremendous topic of incredible breadth and depth, and so we're clearly going to have you on again. But before we leave, and we've only got about a minute and a half, you could give me a very quick explanation of the Day of Declaration.
Yes, the process of externalization will continue. Despite these setbacks, it will grow as more and more disciples take up positions around the world, positions of authority, not because they're members of the hierarchy, but because they're very competent, skilled, and enlightened people who have the best of humanity in their hearts, and they will be seen as the most competent people for these jobs, whether they're working in government or in business or in science or in education or religion. So this will be the continuation and expansion of this externalization of the hierarchy through their disciples in the world. Eventually, and you can see it's going to take some time to turn the whole planet around and basically save all of our kingdoms in nature from the destructive aspects that are going on, that humanity, as the educational process continues, like Planetary Makeover is doing, the existence of the hierarchy will become public knowledge, and that the ashrams of the masters will begin to become public knowledge. And there are 5 focal points for the energies that are pouring into the planet that we call cities, and that's New York and London, Geneva, Darjeeling, and Tokyo. And each one of those centers is responsible for the dissemination of the spiritual energies coming into the planet for a different region of the planet. So in the New York area, the energies will flow through the North and South America. London will be responsible for what used to be the Commonwealth, or what is the Commonwealth of Nations, including parts of Africa. Geneva will be most of Europe. Tokyo will be the Far East, and Darjeeling, which is in North India, will be the Central Asia, including South Asia. So the energies, the spiritual energies of will and purpose and intelligence and love, wisdom, will be pouring in through those cities. And there's an ashram of one of the masters at each one of those focal points. And in the future, as this educational process which you're engaged in expands, these centers, these 5 centers, will be in touch with each other. Everybody will know that they're there. They know that there's disciples there and the master there, and they will be looking to them for help to solve the problems of the world as well. And that at some point there will be an awareness also of the nature of the hierarchy and of the Christ, and that the most enlightened, the most educated people, the most competent people will be looking for the Christ to return, and there'll be a wave of spiritual inspiration which will sweep through the planet, and on that wave of spiritual inspiration, the Christ, Maitreya, will be able to come forward and address the world in the Day of Declaration.
Rich, that was an astounding explanation of this vast topic, which for many of us, the contents of which was a revelation and an incredible education. So we're definitely going to have you back again so that you can enlighten us more on this broad topic that is such a challenge to grasp. And here on Planetary Makeover, that is our primary goal. And so I'm not sure when you'll be back, but we hope it'll be soon. And all of us here at Planetary Makeover want to thank the audience for tuning in, and we'll be back soon. And you can watch us streaming online at any time. I'm your host, David Mynott, and thank you so much, Rich, for joining us.
Thank you, David.
And we will see you, Rich, and we'll see you, the audience, again very soon. Thank you. Visit us on Facebook at #PlanetaryMakeover. This show has been a production of planetarymakeover.org. At our website, we have a link to our bi-weekly live show at 5 p.m. Mondays Pacific Time and 8 p.m. Eastern Time. At our website, we also have a link to our archives and a selection of our shows. For more background info, visit www.shareinternationalwest.org. That's shareinternational-west.org. For related books and DVDs and CDs by Benjamin Creme on the emergence of Maitreya, the world teacher, please go to share-ecart.com. That's share-ecart.com. We also invite you to watch another show that we really love, entitled What in the World is Happening? And the link to check it out is share-international.ca, or visit the Share International Canada Facebook page.